celebrating 48 years on the air. Award-winning Farmweek is a production of Mississippi State University Extension.
Today on Farm Week, a deeper look into which countries can own farmland in the United States. In Southern Gardening, a landscape wonderland, Eddie takes us on a magical trip to a fairy garden. In the markets, Zach's got the numbers. He looks back at all things second quarter. And in our main feature, we all look back 25 years at the Wheel Deal. Farm Week starts right now.
Hello everyone, I'm Zach Ashmore.
And I'm Mike Russell. Great to have you with us again here on Farm Week, brought to you by Mississippi State University Extension. Long before a Chinese spy balloon floated across sensitive military sites in the U.S., people were asking if foreign investors should be allowed to buy the farmland under our feet. In the last 3 years, those voices have gotten louder, leading to a rising number of states enacting laws restricting or banning certain countries from acquiring land here. David Miller has more.
I'm announcing that Syngenta, a Chinese state-owned agrochemical company, must give up its land holdings in Arkansas.
In April of 2023, Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders signed a high-profile law that banned, among others, companies in China from owning land in Arkansas. In October of the same year, the Attorney General of Arkansas ordered Northrop King Seeds to divest itself of 160 acres of agricultural land. Northrop King is a subsidiary of Syngenta, which is owned by the Chinese firm ChemChina. This was one of the first actions taken under a wave of new laws sweeping across the country that added restrictions to foreigners' ability to buy or lease farmland. The Arkansas law prohibits certain foreign parties from owning public or private land where more than 50% of the ownership is controlled by a prohibited foreign entity. Violations of the law can result in foreclosure on the property if the land isn't sold to a qualified buyer. There is also no grandfather clause in the law allowing for purchases already made in the state.
Senate Bill 383 passes.
Concern has been growing in many states about foreign ownership of farmland. Prior to 2023, 14 states had laws prohibiting or restricting foreign ownership or investment in private farmland. Officials with the National Agricultural Law Center at the University of Arkansas say the number of states with some kind of limit on foreign ownership is now 24. Dr. Wendong Zhang is an economist and assistant professor at Cornell University.
Right. I think that the political tension definitely is part of the reason why we are seeing a lot more reaction, especially in the state legislatures. Many of the key sponsors, key legislators in their home states, the Chinese investments actually are quite low.
There are an estimated 1.3 billion acres of privately held agricultural land in the United States. Of that, foreign entities fully or partially own about 43 million acres, according to USDA data. This is 3.4% of all privately held agricultural land and about 2% of all land in the United States. As of 2022, federal records show the largest foreign holder of U.S. property is Canada at 12.8 million acres, which is about 41% of all foreign-owned U.S. land. Next in line is the Netherlands with 4.9 million acres, about 12% of the total. Chinese investors own less than 1% of all foreign-held acreage in the United States, which is a little more than 349,000 acres. The USDA's Farm Service Agency tracks foreign land ownership under the Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act, or AFIDA. Foreign owners of U.S. land, be it agricultural or otherwise, must declare their purchase within 90 days of signing on the dotted line. Failure to do so could result in a federal fine of up to 25% of the value of the land. However, The applications are reviewed annually, and some critics say it could be up to 2 years before an application is reviewed. North Dakota enacted new legislation on foreign land ownership in 2023. The measure may have been motivated by a 2021 purchase of land near Grand Forks by the China-based Fufang Group. The company wanted to build a corn milling plant on the property. The problem was that construction of the $700 million plant would be taking place within 12 miles of the Grand Forks Air Force Base. The purchase was appealed to AFIDA and subsequently reviewed by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. While federal officials concluded they didn't have the authority to rule on the land purchase, in a statement, the committee did say that any construction was a significant threat to national security. The building permit was denied, but the land remains in Fufang's hands. North Dakota's new law adds to restrictions already in place since 1979 and gives powers to counties and municipalities to prohibit local development by a foreign adversary. The new measure specifically prohibits farmland ownership by China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Cuba. Ownership of land by Canadians is allowed. Missouri limits all foreign land ownership to a total of 1% of all arable land in the Show Me State. Of the 27 million acres available, Chinese companies control almost 43,000 acres, about 1.5% of the total. Iowa, which already had limits on the books since 1980, added tougher restrictions in April of 2024. Governor Kim Reynolds stated at the bill signing, "American soil belongs in American hands." Florida also has a ban on foreign land ownership by countries like China, but there is a grandfather clause for land already purchased. Zhang believes there are potential consequences to these new laws on the U.S. economy. His concern is over foreign investment in renewable energy like wind and solar.
Foreign ownership interest is one coming from the renewable energy companies investing in U.S. agricultural development. And so they're often driven by federal and state level tax incentives. And so whether the restriction on foreign investments could potentially slow down achieving renewable energy targets. So that's one of the things that the state government is also debating.
Quick note, just 3 weeks ago, Mississippi Ag Commissioner Andy Gibson wrote an op-ed entitled "Legislature Must Slam Doors Shut on Foreign Land Ownership."
On the lighter side, sometimes all it takes to make your landscape something special is a little pixie dust. Here's the wizard himself, Dr. Eddie Smith, with this week's Southern Gardening segment about fairy gardens.
Today's Southern Gardening is in Hattiesburg, Mississippi at Ross Mansion Bed and Breakfast. They have some enchanting fairy gardens on the property. Let's take a look at some of these magical gardens. At the entrance to the gardens, an old log planter with creeping jenny plants, Gerber daisies, a begonia, and a few other plants sets the stage for the gardens. An old bed headboard is used as a backdrop for the space, and various colored fairy houses are placed to add a whimsical feel. I love how areas underneath the large oak trees have been transformed into magical fairy villages. Moss is used throughout these areas, along with various other shade-tolerant plants. Pea gravel and other rocks are used to represent roads and pathways in the villages. There are many old bird baths in the gardens that have been transformed into magical fairy wonderlands. Each one has its own unique theme and decor. Moss, succulents, and many other small plants are used in the bird bath areas to help create the fairy wonderland setting. I love how antique Recycled objects, such as this old wagon, have been incorporated into the gardens and provide the perfect area for a fairy village setting. An old wheelbarrow, used as a fairy garden village, is another example of how you can repurpose and reuse objects to enhance your garden spaces. If you are ever in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, you should stop by Ross Mansion Bed and Breakfast and see their enchanting, magical fairy gardens. I'm Eddie Smith, and I will see you next time on Southern Gardening.
We'll take a break right here, but don't go away. Coming up, another trip back in time before the turn of the millennium. 25 years ago, this story ran on the show all about the flywheelers, folks who collected and restored antique farm gear. We'll visit one of their festivals where they gather to let future generations know what the good old days were really like. Ever wonder what an old John Deere tractor looked like? Well, wonder no more. The flywheelers. That's coming up on Farm Week. Don't go away.
Here's this week's Farm Week calendar. Just one item this week, the EPA has mandated new training requirements for private pesticide applicators. The requirements, for those who handle restricted use pesticides on farmland and need to renew or obtain certification, began July 1st. The training is on video, covering many new procedures. At the end, there's a 55-question exam, and you must score at least 70%. Cost of the training is $60 per person, with 2 ways to take the test, online or in person at a local extension office. For computer questions about the training and exam, call the Center for Technology Outreach at 662-325-3226. Or for questions more related to who's qualified, who needs to take the training, call 662-325-5829. Remember, the new private pesticide applicator training requirements began July 1st. And that's this week's Farm Week calendar.
I believe in people and their hopes, their aspirations, and their faith. I believe in intellectual freedom to search for and present the truth without bias and with courteous tolerance toward the views of others. I believe that education is a lifelong process, and the greatest university is the home. That my success as a teacher is proportional to those qualities of mind and spirit that give me welcome entrance to the homes of the families I serve. Because I believe these things, I am an extension professional.
Every day, real people are solving problems, learning skills, and achieving goals through extension education. We care about their success and yours. Taking care of what matters. MSU Extension. This week in the markets, a review, Q2 of 2024. Started off with HPAI, ended with lessening drought and a slow replenishing of our national cattle herds. And I stress, slow. We're still on the lower side, but these things take time. Here's the report. April 2024, there was still some concerns over the transference of avian influenza to humans via cattle, but it seemed the situation was well in hand. What wasn't was the future of grain prices, considering planting had just begun. Corn, a major topic.
Where corn has been lately from a price standpoint, it's not been as competitive as it has been in past years. Last year we planted a lot of corn at nearly 95 million acres. So with that, we've had a depression in price. We're carrying over a lot of stocks from last year, so corn acreage had to come back. It's kind of on the low end, though, of where a lot of industry experts thought it would be. 90 million acres was kind of the lowest estimate that industry thought. So it's not really a bullish market factor yet, but it's right on the edge. So as we get into planting with corn, it's going to be very important. If any weather delays, we could probably see a pretty nice price rally in the corn market as we go through plantings.
On the livestock side, the cattle on feed report showed an interesting development. Seems that feedlot placements were slow, odd considering the high price cattle was reaching at the time, and still is right now.
placements over the last 6 months period have been down about 2%. So there's been fewer cattle going into feedlots over the past half year, but a lot of them are staying longer. They're getting heavier, and so we've seen dress weights go up quite a bit, and we've seen cattle just hanging around a little bit longer. How long that lasts is going to be interesting. It's almost like you're kind of building this inventory a little bit, but eventually, those cattle have to roll, and so it's really interesting where the feedlot dynamics are right now.
May saw the near completion of planting and the discussion turned towards weather. In Mississippi, some heavy rains in part of the state caused late planting and some flooded fields. Nationally, good rains during spring showed that the ongoing drought seemed to be on its way out.
So, we are seeing the rains come through. That drought situation is getting alleviated as we go forward, and overall the expectation is for it to improve as, we get into the time of year when the crop really needs the rain. With how fast we're getting the crop planted, I imagine we put more in the ground than USDA's kind of said. We saw this last year when we had really good planting conditions. We planted about 3 million more acres than the USDA said we would in March. When the farmers can plant corn, they like to plant corn. So I imagine that number's going to jump based off how well planting's been going.
There's very few areas in the U.S. right now that are under any sort of drought categorization. So we're entering, 2024 so far in a much better spot. Hopefully going to have more available pasture, and we've also talked about having fewer cattle in general, so that's different for this year, at least for right now, that we're not continuing to talk about drought conditions. One thing to keep an eye on, beef packer margins are pretty tight and even negative in a lot of cases, so that is putting a little bit of pressure on where fed cattle prices can go. The box beef cutout it's at high levels, but it's probably not as high as a lot of people expected it to be, and so that's putting some strain on that particular sector, and putting a bit of a lid on where fed cattle prices can go, and of course that filters back down into feeder cattle prices as well.
Heading into June, the market story shifted towards what growing and harvest season had in store. The June WASDE report didn't really shake up the markets much, but it did give us an idea of what our stock situation looked like.
The trade did expect to see maybe a bump in exports in the old crop because we've had some stronger corn exports recently, so that was a little bit surprised that they didn't adjust the export numbers on corn. But overall, not much new on the corn market. Soybeans side, we saw them adjust domestic crush for the old crop down 10 million bushels or so. So that drove up our ending stocks, just that lower demand coming into the new crop. But so a little bit bearish on soybeans. But outside of that, no huge changes from what we saw last month.
On the cattle side, however, some big news in placements, up 4% compared to 2023. Looks like the cattle rebound had begun.
So this was a big surprise, although it didn't really have a negative impact on prices that you might typically expect whenever you see larger placements. So overall, big headline surprising reaction is placements were a lot higher than were expected last month. Even though we saw larger totals in May than we did in 2023, for the year so far in 2024, we're still running about 2.5% below.
A significant quarter this year. It saw the beginning and ending of planting, the start of growing season, and some important cattle progress.
It's well known that many of our viewers often get nostalgic about the good old days. Well, back in 1999, 25 years ago, Farmweek went to Houston, Mississippi for the Flywheelers Festival. Here's that story, and we pick up with the original intro by former Farmweek anchor Artis Ford.
Well, you hear a lot of talk these days about the end of the century approaching as well as the millennium. Well, now it's an understatement to say that agriculture has changed in that time. There's a group in Mississippi that's working to make sure that the relics of our agricultural and rural past will be around in the next century. Members of the Mississippi Valley Flywheelers Association collect, restore, and exhibit antique farm equipment. They gather in Houston in April and September of each year to let future generations know what the good old days were really like. Farmweek visited the Flywheelers at their April show. To see them is impressive, but to truly experience them, you have to hear them. They're called flywheel engines, the name coming from the heavy flywheels that make them run. In the early part of the 20th century, they helped to modernize farms and businesses as American agriculture moved from manpower and animal power to mechanical might.
A lot of the old fellers, you know, they get a kick out of it. They say, well, man, my dad had one of these, and I learned how to plow on one of those, and it just goes on, and that's what we're in it for.
I guess it's like collecting matchbooks or Barbie dolls or whatever you happen to collect. You can't get enough of them once you get started.
In addition to flywheel engines, the Mississippi Valley Flywheelers Association devotes itself to the preservation of other historic agricultural equipment like tractors and farm implements. The association holds flywheel festivals on the last weekends of April and September in Houston, Mississippi. The events give the association's members a chance to pass on the history they've learned to children and adults. The festivals attract up to 25,000 visitors and exhibitors from 10 to 15 states. Besides the antique farm equipment, there's also an arts and crafts fair and a play area for children. In spite of their size and weight, the gasoline and kerosene-fueled engines develop a small amount of power by today's standards. For example, this 1917 Hercules 600-pound engine generates 1.5 horsepower. The metal flywheels provide the momentum to keep the engine in motion between the times the single-cylinder fires.
Every engine has a flywheel of some kind. You may not necessarily see it, which you don't now in cars and trucks and so forth, but it's still there.
In spite of their low horsepower, the flywheel engines were serious equipment for farms and rural businesses. Their heyday was from the late 1800s into the 1930s, when large areas of the United States did not have electricity. The engines could generate electricity, pump water, grind corn, and power anything which could be turned by a drive belt.
Well, they had one engine that pulled many machines. They carried the engine from one machine to the other. Now you have all machines, each one has an engine on.
Bobby McGowan remembers when a flywheel engine powered his uncle's machine shop in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. The oldest engine in McGowan's 17-strong collection is a 3-horsepower model built in 1909.
It will surprise you how these old folks built these engines with a hammer and a chisel and maybe a file. They didn't have the modern machinery to build it like we did.
This 1916 Galloway is the oldest engine in Ron Diffenderfer's collection. The television engineer caught the old iron bug 18 years ago.
They're just a whole lot of fun to play with. They're a lot of work to get them rebuilt because usually they're pretty old. They're 50, 60, sometimes 80 years old. So, but I just get some kind of fascination out of that simple machinery operating.
They didn't have electric back in those days on the rural areas and even in towns. So they'd have a gasoline engine on the wash machine, and they'd have a big long extension pipe which they'd run outside. They'd run the engine inside, washing the clothes, and the exhaust would go outside.
Francis Werner says if you wanted a Maytag brand clothes washer in those days, it came with a 2-cycle engine. With attachments, you could do more with it than clean clothes.
Maytag was very large in the manufacturing business. They made a wash machine, and it didn't only wash clothes. The Maytag ground corn, it ground meat, it washed clothes. It had all sorts of attachments that went with it.
The owners and restorers of the antique tractors on display love their equipment as much as the flywheelers. It may be romantic to long for the good old days, but one has to remember farming was just as difficult a business when these tractors were new as it is now. They have a beauty, however, that can't help but evoke pleasant memories for those who remember when these machines were a part of everyday life. They proved to be the inspiration for 18-year-old Jason Pickens of Houston, Mississippi, to restore this farmall tractor. It belonged originally to his grandfather, Jack.
It's a year 56 model. It's an LP gas, 300 farmall. It was up on our old cotton picker, but we took it out and changed the gears up on it so it can run forward instead of reverse. And I wanted to restore it because A lot of other people restored theirs, and I want to bring mine out here to show it off too, like everybody else.
There's an antique tractor pull on Saturdays as collectors pit their machines against the weight sled. It's not important who wins, it's the camaraderie that matters.
We come all the way from east of St. Louis, Missouri, which is in Belleville, Illinois, to this show because we love the people down here. The hospitality is fantastic, and you have a good crowd of people coming through.
It's a real close-knit group. You know, these people care about one another and enjoy being around one another. And that's one of the important things with our hobby is it's truly a social event at one of these shows for people who exhibit.
Look like a great festival.
And believe it or not, the Flywheelers still exist and they're still putting on 2 festivals a year. It turns out the next one is right around the corner on September 27th and 28th in, of course, Houston, Mississippi.
Well, next week we get to the meat of the matter, a high school in Mississippi where students are taught how to cut meat.
It's a skill that could come in handy for these kids as the demand for local meat lockers in the state and elsewhere has grown.
Students in meat class are cutting up, but that's a good thing. The class has been so popular over the years, even some of the parents have taken it. They're loin dancing in Mississippi next time on Farm Week.
Remember, if you missed a story, look for past episodes of Farm Week on our website at farmweek.tv.
And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and YouTube. See you next week. Thanks for watching.